So I would tell you that next Sunday that Shane and a group have put a lot of work into getting ready for Youth Sunday, the special activities that are taking place that day, and to not forget as well that he's promoting a concert for that evening. And so I would encourage you to first support the concert here as opposed to the Fifth Sunday hymn sing. That's just seems more appropriate. So we're not telling you not to go to the Fifth Sunday hymn sing. I'm just encouraging you to come and support the concert that's taking place here that Sunday evening. It's not just for the youth. Am I correct on that, Shane? Well, it will be more contemporary. Yes, yes. But you all are welcome to come and support that. So again, not telling you not to go to the Fifth Sunday hymn sing, just saying consider coming here for the concert if you would. I just would encourage that. Now, as far as Wednesday night, wow, we have had fantastic attendance every Wednesday since we've begun this special study. And if you are one of the few that haven't joined us on Wednesday evening, we just got in some new books and workbooks. And so it's one of those things. If you have been thinking about it and you just didn't pull the trigger, it's not too late. We'd love for you to join us on Wednesday evening. It's a great study, a great read, and the workbook gets you to think a little bit about what you've read, and anything like that is going to be very helpful. So if you'd like to talk to me about it and get more information, I'd be happy to help you with that as well. But like I said, we do have some more books and workbooks, and we want everybody that wants one to have that. So just keep that in mind if you would. Uh, does anybody know any details about Pat Arnold's services next Saturday? It's at Fisher's? Oh, okay. It is at 11 to 2. Okay. Okay. With the service at 1? Okay. So um, we're encouraging. We're going to offer the family a funeral dinner, but I don't know yet. I tried to talk to John once already. Didn't get to talk to him very long. But I would tell you, Paula is really taking this hard, and so I would just encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to just reach out to her and offer her some encouragement and prayers. She needs that, and she says she'll be here today for second service. So, no, but I just want you to encourage her if you can um, during this time. So, thank you, Jay, for getting that information to us there. So. This is our second week in a series about Jesus' road to the cross. And last week we kind of looked at Act 1 of this drama, if you will. And we saw that Jesus was praying alone there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we saw that Jesus was alone there in his agony, but we are reminded that we are never alone in ours, correct? Even though we must face these Gethsemane experiences on occasion in order for us to fulfill our God's call on our life, and we never have to face that alone. We just don't, because He is with us all the way, even in our weakest moments. So today we look at Act 2, the arrest and trial of the Christ up to this point, where he is on his way to being crucified. And we're going to actually follow the story in all four Gospels. However, if you'll take your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 14, Mark chapter 14 will be our primary text, and we'll even be going over into chapter 15 today. And so most of the main parts of the message come from Mark, and that will be next week as well. But I would tell you that we will look at several gospel clips out of for the remainder of the sermon as well. And I think the best thing for us to do is to begin by just going over the arrest of Jesus and how that transpired. You see, after he had finished praying, you might remember, he woke up Peter, James, and John and told them that the betrayer had arrived. And so if you look at verse 43 of Mark 14, it tells us there, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up and accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Now, Luke 22, verse 48 said, Jesus said, "Judas, how can you betray me with the Son of Man with a kiss?" And of course, this was a pre-arranged signal that was I guess, a precaution for those who were arresting Jesus, because they wanted to make sure for themselves that they weren't getting tricked by Judas, that this was some kind of thing that put together, and they were going to be embarrassed. They didn't want Judas to pull a fast one, so to speak, and identify the wrong man for them. And secondly, they didn't want Jesus to try to deny that he was the man that they were looking for, and they wanted to see Judas interact with Jesus in a way that would confirm to them who this man was. In fact, the very man that they were looking for. They were truly wanting to get Jesus and take him out, if you will, for lack of a better description. So Judas approached Jesus as a follower would be expected to approach his teacher, and he offered him a greeting and a kiss of respect. Luke 22, verse 49 tells us, when the other disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, "Lord, should we fight?" "We brought the swords," they said. Then Simon Peter drew a sword, according to John 18, and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup the Father has given me?" And then Jesus said in Luke 22, verse 51, "Don't resist anymore." And he touched the place where the man's ear had been and healed him. So all four Gospels mention the high priest's servant's ear being cut off. And Mark just says that it happened and gives no other detail. Matthew says it was done by one of the men who were with Jesus. But John, he points out exactly who it was, being Peter, who did it, and gives the name of the servant as well. And then Luke records for us that Jesus healed the servant's ear. And so what this is for us is an example of how each gospel writer, in telling his story, emphasizes different aspects of the event. Now, this is the only miracle recorded in the whole Passion narrative, okay? Unless you want to consider Jesus surviving the scourging that he went through as a miracle, because it almost had to be, considering how severe it was. But Luke 22, verse 51 says, "But Jesus answered and said, 'Stop, no more of this.' And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, 'Have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. And so what does Jesus do? He calls them out and says, you saw me every day in the temple, and yet you did not come after me or come to see me or to arrest me there. And you do it under the cover of darkness. The power of darkness are yours. These are very ominous words, of course. Jesus knew that the next 12 hours or so, all hell would break loose on earth, and that in the most literal sense of the phrase. The creator of the universe would be beaten and spat upon and ridiculed and murdered by his own creation. In the next 12 hours, evil would reign in a way that it never has before or since. Remember that even though Jesus is God, he is also man, fully human, fully divine. He knows the injustice that is soon to occur. He knows the pain that will be required for him to endure. He knows the spiritual battles that will be fought. And so he says, this is the time when the power of darkness reigns. Verse 50 of our text says, and they all left him and fled. So what happened? All of Jesus's followers abandoned him at this point, and he is all alone. So let's talk about now the trial before the council. Verse 53 of our text says, they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. Now, according to the laws that were established in the Mishnah, which is the Jewish book of procedural law, there are a number of illegalities that occur in Jesus' trial before the council there. First of all, trials were not to be held at night. Did you know that? Did you know that trials were not to be held during festivals? And this was all occurring during the Passover festival. Also, the accused was permitted to have legal counsel. And then capital verdicts, in other words, death of sentences, could not be reached in one day. So I just want to emphasize to you that the miscarriage of justice that was perpetrated against Jesus occurred at the hands of basically a few power-hungry men. This one small group of people abused their power, and they did so because they felt threatened, and it was also for their own personal gain. Now, this is not about placing blame on the Jews of the time, but it's about accepting even our own responsibility, in fact. Edward Schweitzer said these words. He said, whoever is conscious of his own negligence and obedience, of his own failure to love, of the lethargy of his own heart in the midst of the demands of everyday life, cannot escape from his responsibility before God for Jesus' death by fixing the blame upon some other person. That's from a commentary called The Good News According to Mark. Verse 55 of our text says, now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any, for many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. So basically, the witnesses are taking some things that Jesus said, twisting them around. He, of course, had said something earlier to mean something that they say this is what he meant, and of course, he did not mean that at all. In fact, in the book of John, we read where the Jewish leaders confronted him in chapter 2, beginning with verse 18, it says, if you have this authority from God, show us a miraculous sign to prove it. All right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What, they exclaimed, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you can do it in 3 days. but by this temple, Jesus meant his body. So Jesus, of course, is speaking what we would call symbolically here. But they used his words against him. They used his words to trap him. Verse 60 of our text says, the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus is quoting two verses here. He's quoting Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. He's quoting Psalm 110, verse 1. And both verses, of course, are messianic prophecies. So he is making it clear to them that he is, in fact, the Christ. And so this is the response of the high priest. Look at verse 63. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So, if what Jesus said wasn't true, then he would certainly have been guilty of blasphemy. And the council would have every right to be offended. In fact, blasphemy was a punishable offense according to Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16. Jesus' words were outrageous if they weren't true. He was, after all, claiming to have divine power. And this is why we can't pass Jesus off as merely some good moral teacher. Because a man who's merely a good moral teacher doesn't claim to have ultimate authority over heaven and earth. A man who is merely a good moral teacher doesn't say, I will sit at the right hand of God, and someday you will see me come back on the clouds of heaven. A man who says this cannot merely be a good moral teacher. As has been said by so many, such a man would either be a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord of all. Verse 65 of our text. Some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Now this display here taking place is a cowardly type of courage, a bully's type of courage that exploits weakness in others. And once the council members realized that Jesus would not retaliate, well, they became quite bold in their actions. I'm sure it all seemed funny to them. He claimed to have divine authority, and yet he was so easily captured. He claimed to be a king, and yet his followers all deserted him when he was arrested. He claimed to be the Messiah, and yet he stood before them looking like nothing more than a Galilean peasant. So they mocked him, and they pushed him around, and they put him in a cell. So this then brings us to the next stage of the passion, and that's the trial before Pilate. Part 1 of that goes like this. Look at chapter 15 of Mark, verse 1. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, John tells us in chapter 18 a little more detail. So Pilate, this is verse 29, so Pilate the governor went out to them and asked, what is your charge against this man? We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal, they retorted. Then take him away and judge him by your own laws, Pilate told them. Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone, the Jewish leaders replied. This fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. Now, Luke tells us in chapter 23, verse 2, they began at once to state their case. This man has been leading our people to ruin by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king. Now, a Roman governor certainly would not put a Jew on trial for his life simply for violating a Jewish law, in this case being blasphemy. So what the council had to do, well, they had to phrase their accusations against Jesus in such a way that Pontius Pilate would also see Jesus as some kind of threat. By saying that he told the people not to pay taxes, which was an outright lie, and by saying that he claimed to be a king, they were accusing him of crimes against the sovereign power of Rome. So Pilate would have to take these crimes seriously. Now, let's talk about Pontius Pilate. As we will see in a few minutes, he seemed quite eager to be able to acquit Jesus. In truth, he probably didn't hold any animosity at all toward Jesus, and he probably would have preferred not to have to deal with him or the Jewish leaders in any fashion. However, don't get the impression that Pilate was a helpless pawn in the hands of the religious leaders. He was not that easily manipulated. You need to understand that. In fact, had Jesus been guilty of any of these allegations, guess what? Pilate would have known about it for sure. Jesus was already well known in Jerusalem, but he was known as a man of peace, not as some kind of political rebel. He taught his followers to pay their taxes. And he even taught that if a soldier commanded a person to carry his gear for 1 mile, which by Roman law was permitted to happen, the person then should do what? They should carry it 2 miles, right? He publicly stated that citizens should give to Caesar what belongs to him, according to Matthew 22, verse 21. Pilate knew exactly who Jesus was, and he knew he wasn't an actual threat. If Pilate had considered Jesus some kind of threat, he would have taken action against him long before now. And Pilate certainly didn't have a reputation for being tolerant against dissidents. And neither, for that matter, did Rome in general. But Pilate here is in a difficult situation. He's on thin ice with Rome already because of some of his previous offenses in office, which actually included slaughtering people who were protesting his decisions. And during the trial of Jesus, Pilate was looking out for, guess who? Pilate, right? Only Pilate. He cared nothing about actual justice, and though he could have acquitted Jesus, he refused to do so. John 18, verse 33 says, Then Pilate went back inside and called for Jesus to be brought to him. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked him. Now, this brings us to the second part of the trial. Pilate again understood that these charges were ridiculous. If Pilate believed them at all, he would not have tolerated the possibility of any kind of insurrection for even a moment, and Rome would have supported him all the way in that. And so when Pilate found out Jesus was from Galilee, he thought of a brilliant solution. According to Luke 23, verse 6, it says, Oh, is he a Galilean? Pilate asked. When they answered that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. So Pilate saw, here's Herod, and it gives me a nice, safe escape route. If Herod acquitted Jesus, then he was off the hook. If he condemned Jesus, then it was on Herod's shoulders. And even if Herod doesn't pass judgment either way, at least Pilate can state for the record that he made the decision with Herod's input. Luke 23, verse 8 says, Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. So when Jesus remained silent there before Herod, he and his soldiers began mocking him, and they put a royal robe on him, and they sent him back to Pilate. And Luke tells us in chapter 23, verse 12, Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. This brings us to the third part of this trial. You see, Jesus was brought once again before Pilate. Verse 6 of chapter 15 of our text says, Now at the feast he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he was aware that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, Then what shall I do with him who you call the king of the Jews? They shouted back, Crucify him. But Pilate said to them, Why? What evil has he done? And then they shouted all the more, Crucify him. You see, just because a small group of people were shouting for his crucifixion didn't give Pilate permission to abdicate what his obligations were. He claimed that he found no fault in Jesus, but just in case, he let the soldiers flog him. John chapter 18, beginning at verse 1, says, Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers made a crown of long, sharp thorns and put it on his head, and they put a royal purple robe on him. Hail, King of the Jews, they mocked, and they hit him with their fists. Now, most of you have probably saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ. I made reference to that last week. And if you did, you will never soon forget the scene of the scourging of Jesus. Was that accurate, do you think? I believe it was. I believe it was. Flogging or scourging was a very violent form of punishment that many prisoners actually died from in the process. The whip that was most often used had a wooden handle and 9 leather straps. At the end of the strap was either a piece of metal or a rock or a bone, and the whip cut into the back of Jesus, cutting his flesh all the way down to the bone. Now, the Jews had a limit of how many lashes, do you know? 39. One under 40. 39 lashes is the most, right? Rome, how many did they have as a limit? They didn't. That's right. Neither did the garrison of soldiers have any limits on the amount of mistreatment that they could subject a prisoner to as long as they kept him alive for execution. After Jesus was flogged, he was presented again to Pilate. Now, it's hard to guess what it is that motivated Pilate, but this much is clear. Pilate had the power to acquit Jesus. He could have, with no problem, but he didn't. And the first century Christians knew that Pilate was at fault. In fact, one of the earliest creeds of the church contains the phrase that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. Not that he suffered under the Sanhedrin, not that he suffered at the hands of the high priest, but that he suffered under Pontius Pilate. So in spite of all the cat and mouse games that he played about releasing Barabbas and about washing his hands and finding no fault in Jesus and just saying, I take no responsibility, the truth of the matter is Pilate is the one who sentenced Jesus to death. John tells us in chapter 19, verse 16, then Pilate gave Jesus to them to be crucified. Let me close. The trial of Jesus Christ was a travesty of justice according to both Jewish law and Roman law. He should have never been arrested. He should have never been put on trial. He should have never been sentenced to death, yet he was. Here's something for you to meditate on this week if you have the opportunity. Jesus faced man's injustice so that we won't have to face God's justice. We don't approach God demanding that we be given what we deserve, because guess what? What do we deserve? We deserve hell. Romans 6:23 says very clear to us, for the wages of sin is death. We don't come to God demanding justice. We come to him begging for mercy. The Bible tells us he does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. That's from Psalm 103, verses 10 and verse 12. This is the mercy of God. We see it. We see it in the work of Christ, presented right here to us today. He allowed himself to suffer unimaginable pain so that we could experience the healing power, his healing power in our lives. He faced injustice so that we would never have to face justice, because through him we get to experience the mercy of God. Amen? That's my message this morning.